Hello, everyone. I am Jaebeum Cho, economist at the OECD, and today I'll be talking about adapting to shrinkage in Estonia from the land use and spatial planning angle. First, I'll point out some trends in land use in Estonia to open up the discussion. Before we start, I would just like to highlight the trend of depopulation in Estonia to better frame the arguments I make later on. This graph is taken from the National Spatial Plan of Estonia. And since 1991, Estonia's population has decreased by 15%, as Lamia has just mentioned. And although there is a bit of disagreement on the pace of shrinkage, all sources, whether they come from the OECD, Eurostat, or from Estonia itself, suggest that shrinkage will continue. And so despite the depopulation, Estonia is growing outward at quite a significant pace. Some of this increase is natural, especially due to the strong economic growth and thus the need for better infrastructure. However, this does not completely explain the patterns we see in Estonia. What this means is that land use is becoming increasingly inefficient. Estonia experienced an increase of 11% in total built-up area, despite a decrease of roughly 5% in population. Estonia is number 6 among OECD countries in per capita built-up area increase, which is 3 times the OECD average of 6%. And this trend is even more evident when we look at data on settlement patterns. In the last 12 years, the number of inhabited population grids increased by 30%. Importantly, only 2%, or roughly 24,000 of the over 1.3 million inhabitants of Estonia, live in these new areas, which are colored red on the map. Furthermore, 91% of these 1 square kilometer grids are inhabited by less than 5 people. And 97% are inhabited by less than 10 people. This is quite an issue because almost never do you see once developed land return to an undeveloped state. Together with depopulation, Estonia will need to manage this large amount of developed land, which is costly, with less and less fiscal resources in the future. An important thing to emphasize is that the outward growth in Estonia is again not due to increased demand for land. At the county level, growth in built-up area is uncorrelated with changes in population. Harju County, where the capital Tallinn is, was the only county that experienced both an increase in population and built-up area. Percentage-wise, you can see that almost all counties experienced relatively even growth in built-up area, ranging in the 7 to 10% range. However, you can see that even counties such as Ida-Viru or Viljandi that experienced close to 20% population decline also experienced close to a 10% increase in built-up area. Other counties are in a similar situation. Another important observation is that spatial polarization is increasing in Estonia across multiple domains. This map shows you the population change within each 1 square kilometer population grid. The blue grids are those where population increased by 50% or more between 2006 and 2018. And the red grids are those where population decreased by 50%. You can see that population increased in the urban periphery, right outside the functional urban areas of Harju and Tartu. And the population, on the contrary, did not increase within these functional urban areas. Furthermore, you can see that the rest of the country, especially the remote regions, experienced significant population decline. And so we see that urban sprawl and rural depopulation coexist in Estonia. This polarization has led to great disparities in land prices, for one. Residential land prices in urban municipalities is 6 times more expensive than in rural ones. And overall prices have decreased much faster in these rural areas. Housing prices follow a similar trend. For example, the median price of an apartment in Tallinn was 10 times higher than that in the city of Valga. And it's not just real estate prices. Income disparities are also much greater in Estonia compared to other OECD countries, which also results in disparities in tax revenues. One result of depopulation and polarization is high vacancy rates and also an old housing stock. This is because most of the new construction happens near the main urban centers, while real estate markets struggle to function at all in the remote areas. You can see here that in many rural counties, 30% or more of housing was built before World War II. Also currently, 25% of Estonia's housing stock is empty, and this percentage is much higher, over 30% in some cases, in the rural and remote regions. What this results in is a vicious cycle where disparities in the housing market makes it difficult for people to move between regions, which again reinforces regional disparities and chronic labor shortages in the non-metropolitan regions. Another important factor often overlooked is the energy inefficiency of housing. Sparse settlement patterns result in more detached houses that consume more energy per square meter and are farther away from each other, which increases travel distances. Estonia is #1 among OECD countries within the residential sector's share of total consumption of energy, where the residential sector accounts for 32% of total consumption. This can be partially attributed to land use patterns and the old building stock. When combined with the transport sector, Estonia is #6 among OECD countries at a combined 60% of total consumption. In effect, the residential and transport sectors are consuming a disproportionately large share of energy. In the Estonian case, this energy is much more carbon intensive to produce because of the heavy use of oil shale. In turn, this is one of the reasons why Estonia is the most carbon intensive economy in the OECD by far. Next, I'll briefly talk about Estonia's spatial planning framework. The planning system of Estonia is hierarchical, starting from the National Spatial Plan that sets overall outlines for spatial policy. County-wide spatial plans act as spatial plans at the regional level, and at the local level, comprehensive plans are the main instrument used by local governments to steer land use. And then detailed spatial plans exist at the bottom to implement local comprehensive plans and determine building rights, plots, and other requirements. One key assessment for Estonia is that there is a patchwork of different regional level plans. One of the causes of this fragmentation is the fact that the county-wide spatial plan is not substantive enough to promote coherent regional development. These plans often do not cover important areas such as health, education, or economic development, at least directly. As a result, spatial planning through the county plans is separate from strategic planning on social and economic issues that is governed separately by county development strategies. There is also the Regional Policy Program and Regional Policy Action Plan that is also separate from all of these other frameworks. The recent Planning Act reform also resulted in county-wide spatial plans no longer having authority to plan projects spanning local boundaries, this being replaced with the National Designated Spatial Plan. I'll also briefly discuss spatial planning at the local level. Local spatial planning did not exist in the Soviet era and has thus only started in Estonia after independence in 1991. The Planning Act itself was only enacted in 1995 and has been revised extensively since then. As a result, municipalities are still adjusting to the role of implementing planning policies. In the meantime, local comprehensive plans still struggle to promote coherent spatial development and do not enforce planning boundaries in line with population projections. As can be seen here, detailed spatial plans, which are low-level plans that implement the comprehensive plan, often override the higher-level plan, resulting in small-scale, sprawling developments that are privately initiated often and adopted in random order. Another issue is that many municipalities find the process of devising comprehensive plans too difficult and time-consuming, leading them to outsource the preparation to consultants. While this is not always bad practice, what often happens is that the local authority retreats from their leading role in planning and leaves the planning process to these consultants. This also contributes to the development patterns we see today. A final observation is that legal frameworks seem to encourage sparse development. For one, expropriation is limited and challenging, which makes it difficult to demolish empty houses. Estonia is one of the few countries that does not have a clause in the legislation that allows expropriations for the greater public good, or for interests that concern the coherent spatial development of territories. Other neighboring countries, such as Latvia, Finland, and Poland, have such clauses. Furthermore, apartment buildings need to be more than half empty to have grounds for expropriation, and expropriating empty detached housing is not possible. This is a problem, especially considering that most of the vacant housing in remote areas are likely going to be detached housing. Another issue is that land taxes are simply too low to incentivize the efficient use of land. Municipalities usually just tax land at the highest rate, which is 2.5%, and the taxable land values are unrealistically low because they have not been reevaluated since 2001. There is also a greater exemption of land taxes for rural areas, which further encourages sparse settlement patterns. Finally, impact fees are also only used in a limited basis, meaning that it is hard to internalize the social costs of spread out settlement by charging landowners or developers for increased infrastructure burden. So what land use and spatial planning policies are important to handle the shrinkage problem in Estonia? Most importantly, land consumption needs to be reduced and densification needs to be encouraged. These scatter plots show how greater land consumption per capita is strongly correlated with both an increase in costs for the delivery of services and also increased greenhouse gas emissions. This is because sparse settlement patterns lead to more services and infrastructure needed across a broader area, increasing costs. In the case of public transportation, for example, it becomes very difficult to provide in sparse areas because there is a minimum number of users needed for sustained demand. Even more important, however, is the environmental problems sparse development causes, which has been documented extensively in the literature. In addition to greater carbon emissions, sparse development is one of the main causes of biodiversity loss and land degradation. These are important issues, especially in the Estonian case, because almost all land is developed from converted forests and farmland. To reduce land consumption and make settlement patterns more efficient, most importantly, local comprehensive plans should be able to steer coherent spatial development. They need to incorporate population projections and enforce settlement limits through growth boundaries based on these projections. For example, many countries in the OECD use a combination of incentives and regulations to deter sprawl. An incentive-based policy of providing government subsidies and support programs together with infrastructure investment within the boundaries has proven to be effective in many cases. In addition, the detailed spatial plan cannot override the local comprehensive plan in the current fashion. and planning needs to break free from private interests. Local plans should also be flexible enough to adapt to changing demographic trends and economic opportunities. Given Estonia's short history of municipal level planning, the central government also needs to provide assistance in capacity building, possibly by maintaining a central pool of planning experts. Another important recommendation is the need to strengthen regional spatial planning. This not only brings policy coherence, but also encourages inter-municipal cooperation that is necessary to bring down service delivery costs and increase economies of scale. The county-wide spatial plan needs to be expanded in scope and strengthened, and the role between the county-wide spatial plan and other strategic frameworks needs to be clarified. Importantly, county development strategies, along with other regional frameworks, should be implemented within the regional spatial planning system. Giving back county plans the authority to plan projects that span local boundaries is also important, especially to promote intermunicipal cooperation and bring down costs. Reforming land taxes is also important to encourage compact development. Relaxing legislation on land tax rates can give municipalities greater autonomy and encourage efficient land use. Land taxes should not incentivize spread out development and the ownership of single-family homes over multifamily homes. Tax exemption for residential land in remote areas can be abolished or at least reduced, while exemptions in denser areas can be relaxed further. The additional revenues collected from land taxes can be reinvested towards improving amenities in shrinking regions. Impact fees need to be assessed regularly to internalize the costs of remote living. And of course, all of this needs to come together with a reevaluation of taxable land values. Finally, we need to stress the importance of linking demolition and renovation of housing within spatial planning. The current projects ongoing in Estonia, while successful to a certain degree, are still in their beginning phases and have been implemented in a piecemeal fashion at the site level. These projects need to be implemented at a larger scale within the spatial planning framework through local and county plans. Importantly, the emphasis needs to be on shrinking from the outside in, where buildings in the outskirts are mainly demolished, while those in the town centers are remodeled. The Stadtumbau program in Germany, for example, that was started in response to shrinkage in East Germany, is a good example of such efforts. Expropriation law also needs to be streamlined, and it must be made possible to expropriate empty detached housing. When expropriation proves difficult, it can be complemented by other measures such as land readjustment, which gives back a portion of the land to landowners that is higher in value due to infrastructure improvements made using the land claimed for public use. So thank you all for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to the discussions that follow. Thank you once again.